It's August 21st, 2026. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. And tonight we're diving into a story that's honestly one of the most consequential arms trafficking revelations of this entire war. And it involves a player that's been trying very hard to stay in the shadows this whole time: China. Reuters broke a story citing 3 separate sources familiar with the deal that Iran is expected to receive within weeks a shipment of up to 400 Chinese-made shoulder-fired air defense missile systems. 400. That's not a trickle of black market weapons smuggled in through some back channel. That's a formal contract, a paper trail, an actual company name attached to it, and a route mapped out from Western China through Pakistan and into Iran. And China's own foreign ministry response when confronted with this, they called the reports completely groundless, which, if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you already know exactly what that phrase usually means. So here's what we're covering today. We're breaking down exactly what these 400 missile systems actually are and why they matter so much to Iran's rebuilding effort right now. We're walking through the entire supply chain, the Hong Kong shell company, the dollar figures, the smuggling route through Pakistan, and why that route specifically was chosen. We're covering the broader pattern of Chinese weapons flowing to Iran that goes back months before this specific shipment, including anti-ship missiles and air defense systems that already showed up on the battlefield. We're going to walk through exactly why Iran's original air defense network collapsed in the first place, and why that collapse makes this particular shipment so strategically important. And then stick around, because the Global Roundup today has some genuinely wild developments that tie directly into this exact same China-Iran-Russia axis story. And then we'll wrap it all up in the 4D chess strategic analysis section, where we break down why China keeps denying involvement publicly while their fingerprints keep showing up all over this war. Let's get into it. Let's start with the actual reporting itself, because this didn't come from some anonymous social media account or a sketchy Telegram channel. This came from Reuters, citing 3 informed sources with direct knowledge of the transaction. According to that reporting, Iran is expected to receive the first shipment out of up to 400 Chinese-made shoulder-launched air defense systems within just a few weeks of the story breaking. The contract itself is valued at somewhere between $60 and $70 million, and it covers the purchase of what's specifically identified as QW-12 and FN-16 systems, which are man-portable air defense systems, commonly referred to in the defense world as MANPADS. If that acronym sounds familiar, it's because we've talked about MANPADS on this channel before in the context of this exact same war. These are shoulder-fired missile launchers, portable enough for a single soldier to carry, aim, and fire at a low-flying aircraft, a helicopter, a drone, or a cruise missile, all without needing a radar system that would give away the shooter's position ahead of time. Now here's where it gets specific enough that you can actually verify the seriousness of this deal. The QW-12 and the FN-16 aren't some generic, off-the-shelf Chinese export product sold to anyone with cash. These are legitimately capable systems, and China has spent years building an entire export business around this exact category of weapon, competing directly with older Russian-designed systems like the Igla and American systems like the Stinger that have dominated the MANPADS market for decades. The FN-16 in particular is described as the more capable interceptor of the two, with an engagement range stretching from roughly 500 meters out to somewhere between 5.5 and 6 kilometers, and it can hit targets flying as low as 10 meters off the ground all the way up to nearly 4,000 meters in altitude. That altitude and range envelope covers basically everything Iran has been desperately trying to defend against throughout this entire war. Low-flying fighter jets making bombing runs, cruise missiles skimming in under radar coverage, and armed drones conducting surveillance or strike missions. Both systems use dual-band optical seekers, meaning they lock onto heat signatures using a combination of sensor technologies rather than relying purely on radar, which makes them harder to spoof with countermeasures and, critically, doesn't emit a detectable radar signature that American electronic warfare aircraft could pick up and target before the missile even launches. And the math on how Iran could actually deploy 400 of these systems is honestly staggering when you break it down. Defense analysts estimate that if Iran organizes these into 4 launcher detachments, they could stand up somewhere between 75 and 100 separate firing positions. If they go with 6 launcher detachments instead, that same total inventory could still support somewhere between 50 and 66 individual units. Each one of those units could realistically be assigned to protect a completely separate strategic target: an airfield, a missile base, a command facility, an oil refinery, a power station, an ammunition depot, a nuclear-related site, or a logistics corridor. Think about what that means practically. Iran isn't just buying 400 missiles to hand out randomly. They're buying the infrastructure to build a distributed, layered air defense network that could theoretically cover dozens of high-value targets simultaneously across the entire country, all without needing a single functioning radar system that American aircraft could detect and destroy first. And when you consider the average cost per launcher works out to somewhere between $150,000 and $233,000, once you factor in missile rounds, optical sights, training equipment, spare parts, and transport containers, you start to understand this isn't a bargain bin purchase. This is a serious, calculated investment in rebuilding a defensive capability that Iran genuinely believes it cannot survive without. Now let's talk about how this deal is actually structured, because the paper trail here is genuinely fascinating from an intelligence perspective. According to the sources who spoke with Reuters, the contract was signed with a company called Zhongqing Baoxiang International Investment, which is based in Hong Kong. This company is described as acting purely as an intermediary, essentially a middleman, sitting between the Iranian buyers and the actual Chinese supplier providing the hardware. If you followed any sanctions evasion story involving China over the past decade, you already know exactly why a deal like this would route through a Hong Kong shell company instead of a direct government-to-government transaction. Hong Kong occupies this unique legal gray zone, technically part of China, but historically operating under a separate legal and financial system, which makes it an extremely convenient place to structure a transaction that Beijing wants to be able to deny with a straight face if it ever gets exposed publicly. And exposed is exactly what happened here. The actual logistics of how these weapons are supposed to physically move from China to Iran are just as telling as the financial structure. According to the reporting, the plan calls for the cargo to first be transported by air out of Urumqi, which sits way out in western China in the Xinjiang region, and then routed through Pakistan before finally reaching Iran. The sources didn't specify whether the final leg from Pakistan into Iran would happen by air or by land, but either way, that routing choice is deliberate. Urumqi isn't some random departure point. It's about as far from Beijing's political center of gravity as you can get while still being inside China, which gives the shipment plausible deniability at the point of origin, tucked away from the commercial ports and major cargo hubs along China's eastern seaboard, where international observers and customs monitoring tend to be far more rigorous. And running it through Pakistan adds another layer of complexity for anyone trying to track the shipment through conventional monitoring, because you're now dealing with two separate national airspaces and two separate sets of customs and export paperwork, or the deliberate absence of it, before the weapons ever touch Iranian soil. Now, when Reuters actually reached out to China's foreign ministry for comment on all of this, the response was about as predictable as it gets if you've been watching this pattern play out for months. They said the relevant reports are completely groundless. No further explanation, no specific rebuttal of any of the details, the shell company, the departure point, the dollar figures, just a blanket denial. And Iran's own foreign ministry didn't even bother responding to the request for comment at all, which in diplomatic terms is often just as telling as an actual denial would be. Silence, in this context, usually means there's nothing they can say that wouldn't make the situation worse. But here's the thing that makes this story land so much harder than it would if it were an isolated incident, because it isn't. This 400 missile MANPADS deal is just the latest chapter in a pattern that's been building for months. Go back to earlier this year, and American intelligence agencies were already picking up mounting evidence that China had begun supplying missiles to Iranian armed forces. One analysis at the time specifically flagged Chinese shoulder-fired MANPADS, likely FN-16 variants, as a serious possibility for what actually shot down an American F-15E over Iran back on April 3rd of this year. Think about that for a second. This isn't a hypothetical future risk we're discussing. Chinese-supplied shoulder-fired missiles may have already brought down an American fighter jet in combat months before this current 400-unit shipment was even reported. That intelligence assessment at the time was described by American officials as not definitive, and there was no direct evidence Iran had actually received or deployed that earlier shipment. But combined with parallel reporting about Russian intelligence assistance flowing into Iran around the same period, analysts at the time were already warning that China and Russia appeared to be aiding Iran in a coordinated, systematic fashion aimed at contributing to an American strategic setback in the Middle East. And it goes deeper than that. Reporting earlier this year alleged that China had secretly supplied Iran with weapons valued at roughly $5 billion, and when you actually see the full list of what was allegedly included, it reads like a complete air defense modernization package, rather than some limited arms sale. 50 CM-302 anti-ship cruise missiles, 6 HQ-16B surface-to-air missile systems, 1,200 FN-16 MANPADS, 300 Sunflower, 200 kamikaze drones, 3 HQ-9B long-range anti-ballistic missile systems, 6 HQ-7AE short-range air defense systems, 4 YLC-9B radars, 3 Type 305A radars, 6 SLC-2 counter-battery radars, and even 50 HQ-19 anti-satellite interceptor missiles. That's not a shopping list for a country trying to scrape by with whatever they can find. That's a comprehensive, top-to-bottom air and missile defense architecture, and reporting at the time suggested China may have delivered these systems directly out of its own People's Liberation Army inventory, planning to backfill and replenish their own stockpiles later, specifically because the fast-tracked delivery timeline didn't leave room to manufacture everything from scratch on short notice. The CM-302 piece of that deal is worth pausing on specifically, because those are supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, precisely the kind of weapon Iran would want if their strategy revolves around threatening American naval assets and commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, which, if you've watched our other coverage on this channel, you know has been exactly Iran's strategy throughout this entire conflict. Reporting indicated Iran actually attempted to use some of these Chinese-supplied anti-ship missiles against U.S. Navy warships, and that those attempts failed to actually hit their targets. But failure doesn't mean the threat wasn't real. It just means American defensive systems worked as intended that particular time. You don't get lucky forever against a growing stockpile of increasingly sophisticated anti-ship weaponry, and every single attempt, successful or not, forces American naval commanders to burn through expensive interceptor missiles and keep their crews at an elevated state of alert night after night, which is its own form of attrition even when nothing actually connects. There's also a separate track of reporting worth mentioning here because Reuters previously indicated that Iran was close to securing yet another agreement with China, specifically to acquire additional anti-ship cruise missiles, though Reuters said they couldn't confirm whether that particular agreement actually went through to completion. And on top of all of the Chinese supply lines, there's also been reporting that Iran signed a separate, roughly €500 million air defense deal with Russia for a system called Verba, which tells you Tehran isn't putting all their rebuilding eggs in one basket. They're simultaneously working multiple foreign supply relationships at once, pulling from both Beijing and Moscow in parallel to rebuild what the war has systematically destroyed. It's essentially a dual-track reconstruction effort. Chinese MANPADS and anti-ship capability on one side, Russian air defense systems on the other, running concurrently rather than sequentially, which tells you just how urgently Tehran views its own vulnerability right now. All right, quick pause here, because if you're finding this breakdown genuinely useful, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe now, because we're tracking every single one of these arms supply threads as they develop, connecting details that a lot of outlets just don't have the bandwidth to dig into properly. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing when you take the 2 seconds to do that, so thank you to everyone who does. Let's keep rolling, because there's an important piece of context about why Iran needs all of this so badly right now, and it goes back to the very first days of this war. If you go back through this entire conflict, one of the recurring themes we've covered on this channel is just how thoroughly Iran's original air defense network got dismantled in the opening days of the war. Back on February 28th, American and Israeli forces launched nearly 900 strikes in a 12-hour window specifically targeting Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and leadership. And that initial wave alone killed the supreme leader and dozens of other senior figures. When your air defense network gets gutted that fast and that comprehensively right at the outset of a war, you don't just lose equipment, you lose the entire layered system of radars, command nodes, and interceptor batteries that were supposed to talk to each other and coordinate a response in real time. Rebuilding that from scratch, especially while you're simultaneously under nightly strikes, as we've covered extensively in our other videos on this war, 13 consecutive nights at one point, 6 provinces hit in a single night during another stretch, that kind of sustained pressure is an enormous undertaking for any military, let alone one that's already lost its top leadership and much of its centralized command structure in the opening hours. And that's exactly the vacuum these Chinese MANPADS deals are trying to fill. Here's the strategic logic from Tehran's side, and it's actually pretty coherent once you lay it out. If you can't rebuild a full radar-guided, networked air defense system fast enough because your radar sites keep getting bombed as soon as they go up, you pivot toward distributed, portable, radar-independent systems instead. Shoulder-fired MANPADS don't need a fixed radar installation. They don't need a command center broadcasting a targeting solution that American electronic warfare aircraft can detect and destroy before a single missile even launches. You just need trained personnel positioned close enough to a target with a functioning optical seeker and a missile ready to fire. It's a defense strategy built around survivability through dispersal rather than raw technological superiority. And honestly, given how effectively American and Allied air power dismantled Iran's centralized systems in the opening days of this war, it makes a certain amount of tactical sense from a purely military logic standpoint, even if it comes wrapped in an enormous amount of geopolitical risk for everyone involved, China included. Now let's talk about why this particular story matters so much beyond just the immediate battlefield implications, because there's a much bigger geopolitical picture sitting underneath all of this. China has spent years publicly positioning itself as a neutral party in Middle Eastern conflicts, talking up its role as a diplomatic broker, most notably when it helped facilitate the original normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran a few years back, a moment Chinese state media treated as a genuine diplomatic triumph, and evidence of Beijing's growing role as a responsible global power capable of resolving conflicts that Western diplomacy couldn't. That carefully cultivated image of neutrality is directly at odds with a Hong Kong shell company running 400 missile systems through Xinjiang and Pakistan into a country actively at war with the United States. And it's not the first time China's export control claims have run into direct contradiction either. Last year, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned several Chinese entities specifically for supplying chemical precursors to Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps for use in its ballistic missile program. China's response to those sanctions at the time was almost identical to their response to this latest MANPADS story. They said they were unaware of the specific cases cited and insisted they strictly enforce export controls on dual-use products. Same denial, different shipment, month after month. And at some point, the sheer volume and consistency of these reports starts to matter more than any individual denial does. Let's also talk about Pakistan's role in this routing choice for a second, because that's not a throwaway detail either. Pakistan sits in a genuinely complicated position here, maintaining relationships with both China and the United States simultaneously, and serving as a transit corridor for a weapons shipment headed to a country actively at war with America puts Islamabad in an uncomfortable spot if this gets confirmed and scrutinized further. Whether Pakistani officials were fully aware of what was moving through their airspace or territory, or whether this was structured specifically to move through with minimal visibility to Pakistani customs and intelligence services, is honestly one of the more interesting open questions in this entire story. And it's the kind of detail that tends to surface more clearly once a shipment like this actually gets intercepted or confirmed on the ground, rather than just reported through anonymous sources ahead of time. And it's worth remembering that Pakistan and China share an extremely close, decades-long strategic partnership, often described by officials in both countries as an all-weather friendship, which makes it entirely plausible that a shipment like this could move through Pakistani territory with a fairly high degree of official awareness, if not outright cooperation, even if no Pakistani government spokesperson is ever going to confirm that on the record. You made it to the global roundup section, my friend, so let's zoom out and connect a few more threads, because there's a broader pattern playing out across multiple fronts that ties directly back into everything we just covered. Iranian officials confirmed just recently that Tehran was preparing to strike 3 separate Ukrainian targets with ballistic missiles, which is a genuinely significant escalation because it shows Iran isn't just receiving weapons from this China-Russia axis, they're actively contributing their own capabilities back into Russia's war effort against Ukraine at the same time. That's the reciprocal side of this relationship that doesn't get nearly as much attention as the missiles flowing into Iran. Tehran has spent years supplying Russia with Shahed drones for use against Ukrainian cities, and now there's reporting suggesting Iran may be looking at direct ballistic missile strikes on Ukrainian targets themselves. It's a three-way weapons and support relationship, China supplying Iran, Iran supplying Russia, and all three governments finding themselves increasingly aligned against a shared set of Western adversaries, even while each of them publicly denies the depth of that cooperation whenever a reporter actually asks about it directly. Meanwhile, on a completely different front, Taiwan has been actively working to shore up its own defenses, receiving additional F-16V Block 70 fighters from Lockheed just recently, part of a broader pattern of Western democracies accelerating defense cooperation with Taipei as tensions with Beijing continue simmering in the background. That timing matters, because while China is reportedly funneling weapons toward Iran to help Tehran survive a war against the United States, Washington is simultaneously reinforcing Taiwan's own defenses against a potential future Chinese move in the Pacific, which tells you both sides are treating these theaters as connected rather than isolated. And over in Europe, Ukraine is set to receive the Aster 30 missile defense system from France, another piece of the broader picture of Western nations, continuing to reinforce Ukraine's air defenses, even as Russia keeps hammering Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. When you step back and look at all of these individual stories side by side, China quietly arming Iran, Iran quietly arming Russia, the West arming both Ukraine and Taiwan in response, you start to see the actual shape of the global alignment forming underneath all the individual headlines. This isn't really a series of disconnected regional conflicts anymore. It increasingly looks like two broad coalitions testing each other's resolve and capacity across multiple theaters simultaneously. And the 400 missiles heading to Iran are just one small, specific data point inside that much bigger picture. There's also the interception angle worth mentioning here, because even as Iran works to rebuild its own defenses with Chinese hardware, its offensive missile capability is still running into real resistance elsewhere on the map. NATO forces operating over Turkish airspace have intercepted multiple Iranian ballistic missiles during this war, a reminder that even a rebuilt, better defended Iran still has to contend with the fact that its own missiles aren't getting through unopposed either. Turkey occupies its own complicated position in all of this, the only NATO member in the Middle East, with a long history of regional rivalry with Iran, and Turkish officials have had to walk a careful line throughout this war, participating in NATO's collective air defense posture while also publicly characterizing some Iranian strikes as legitimate acts of self-defense. That kind of balancing act tells you just how tangled the regional alliances have become. Nobody in this part of the world gets to sit purely on one side of this conflict without some kind of complicated diplomatic contortion required to justify it. That brings us to the 4D chess strategic analysis section, my friends, so let's put this whole board together, because there's a clear logic running underneath every piece of this story once you connect it properly. China's public position throughout this entire war has been one of studied, careful neutrality, calling for de-escalation, offering rhetorical support for diplomatic solutions, while consistently denying any direct involvement in arming either side. But the actual paper trail, a Hong Kong intermediary company, a specific departure point in Xinjiang, a documented route through Pakistan, a dollar figure attached to a named contract, tells a very different story than the public statements do. And this isn't the first time that gap has shown up. The alleged $5 billion weapons package earlier this year, the chemical precursor sanctions from last year, the FN-16 MANPADS potentially involved in shooting down an American F-15E back in April, every single one of these stories follows the exact same pattern. Reporting emerges, China denies it flatly and completely, and then months later another very similar story emerges involving a different shipment, a different shell company, a different route, but the exact same underlying relationship. Here's the honesty check on why China would take this risk in the first place, because it's genuinely worth asking. Beijing has enormous economic interests tied up in stability throughout the Middle East. They import a massive share of their oil through the exact same Strait of Hormuz that Iran has spent this entire war trying to threaten and control. So why would China risk their carefully cultivated reputation and their own energy security by quietly arming the one country actively destabilizing that exact waterway? The most coherent explanation is that China views a weakened, distracted, resource-drained United States, tied down fighting a prolonged, expensive conflict in the Middle East, while simultaneously trying to support Ukraine and reinforce Taiwan, as strategically valuable to Beijing's own long-term interests in the Pacific, even if it means accepting some short-term risk to their own energy imports and their public image as a neutral broker. Every dollar and every missile that keeps Iran fighting is, from that particular strategic lens, a dollar and a missile that isn't being spent watching China's own moves in the South China Sea or around Taiwan quite as closely. It's a calculated trade-off, short-term energy risk in exchange for long-term strategic distraction of their primary rival, and it's the kind of trade-off that only makes sense if you're thinking in years and decades rather than in the next fiscal quarter. And here's the question nobody's really asking loudly enough. If 400 MANPADS get confirmed as actually delivered, and if the pattern holds the way it has all year, more shipments follow, does the current level of denial from Beijing actually hold up under sustained international pressure? Or does this eventually force Washington into a much more direct confrontation with China itself, separate entirely from the ongoing war with Iran? Sanctioning individual Chinese entities, as we've already seen happen with the chemical precursor case last year, clearly hasn't been enough to actually stop this pattern from repeating itself. At some point, the question shifts from what specific weapons is China sending to what is the actual cost Beijing is willing to accept for continuing to do this, and whether that cost is about to get a lot higher than it's been so far throughout this entire war. Because right now, the consequences China has faced for this pattern of behavior have been almost entirely rhetorical. A sanctioned shell company here, a sanctioned entity there, strongly worded reports from Reuters and American intelligence agencies, but nothing that's actually disrupted the flow of weapons in any meaningful, sustained way. If 400 MANPADS show up in Iranian hands and start appearing in combat footage the way earlier Chinese-supplied systems reportedly already have, that calculus may not stay purely rhetorical for much longer. It's also worth thinking about what this means for the average person sitting at home watching gas prices and shipping costs climb throughout this war, because none of this happens in a vacuum. Every additional Chinese air defense system that reaches Iranian hands makes the eventual reopening of the Strait of Hormuz that much harder to achieve. If Iran can stand up 50, 60, even 100 distributed MANPADS positions, protecting its coastal missile batteries and fast boat staging areas along the southern coastline, that directly complicates the kind of American and allied strike packages that have been systematically dismantling Iran's maritime harassment capability night after night throughout this campaign. A pilot who used to fly a low-altitude strike run with relative confidence now has to factor in the possibility of an undetected, radar-silent MANPADS team sitting somewhere along the flight path, which changes tactics, altitude profiles, and risk tolerance in ways that slow down the entire campaign. Slower campaigns mean a longer war. A longer war means the strait stays disrupted longer, oil prices stay elevated longer, and global shipping insurance premiums stay inflated longer. So a single Reuters story about 400 missiles moving through Xinjiang and Pakistan isn't just a regional military footnote. It's a data point that ripples all the way out to what people are paying at the pump on the other side of the planet. There's also a longer historical pattern worth remembering here, because China supplying weapons to conflict zones while publicly denying it isn't new behavior invented for this particular war. Beijing has a long, well-documented history of using exactly this kind of layered, deniable supply chain, intermediary companies, third country transit routes, ambiguous end-user documentation, to move military hardware into sensitive conflicts around the world for decades, from various African civil wars to earlier chapters of tension in the Middle East itself. What makes this particular case different isn't the method, it's the scale and the specific moment it's happening in. 400 units in a single documented shipment, in the middle of an active, ongoing war between Iran and the United States, with American intelligence agencies already on record from months earlier, flagging a broader pattern of Chinese missile assistance, is a much bigger and much riskier bet for Beijing than a quieter, smaller-scale transfer might have been. It suggests either growing confidence on China's part that the risk of exposure is manageable, or growing urgency on Iran's part that's pushing Beijing to move faster and larger than they might otherwise be comfortable with. So what do you think happens next here? Does this 400 missile shipment actually get confirmed and intercepted? Or does it slip through exactly the way previous shipments reportedly have? And do you think Washington eventually takes direct action against China over this? Or does this pattern just keep quietly repeating itself month after month while the world watches and does little more than issue statements? Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear your take on this one, especially if you've been following the broader arms trafficking side of this war closely, because there's a lot of nuance here that's easy to miss if you're only catching the headlines. And if you found this breakdown useful, share it with someone who's been trying to understand how deep this China-Iran-Russia relationship actually runs, because there's a lot more connecting these stories than most coverage out there is willing to lay out clearly. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you sticking around for the full breakdown, and I'll see you in the next one.